Hey everyone, welcome to today's Explainer. So, we've got a really fascinating one for you today. We're looking at a brand new book that just launched. It's called The Death of Utopia, Karl Popper and the Fall of Maoist Ideology in the Philippines by Dr. Jose Joel Maguiza Saigo. What we're basically going to do today is perform a forensic intellectual autopsy on a really long-standing ideological conflict. And just to be clear right up front, we're approaching this completely neutrally. We're just going to unpack the core arguments of the text, looking at exactly how the author uses philosophy, history, and even first-hand accounts to dissect revolutionary movements.
Okay, let's dive right into this. The author sets up this absolute, uncompromising moral baseline right from page 1. Quote, "No utopia is worth a single Filipino life." The book's completely forceful thesis, which is really the author's definitive contribution to the pursuit of peace here, is that literally no vision of a perfect society can ever excuse the loss of human life. The author is actually a former recruit of the underground movement himself, so he's not just sitting back debating abstract economic theories. He's evaluating the real, flesh-and-blood human cost of absolute ideological certainty.
And that brings us to the central tension of the entire analysis. It's kind of laid out like a philosophical thriller. The book asks, what exactly happens when prophecy collides with facts? Seriously, think about it for a second. How do movements that claim to know the absolutely guaranteed, inevitable course of history react when history, when it doesn't go their way? Do they actually change their theory to fit reality, or do they try to force reality to fit the theory?
Moving into section 1, the price of utopia, or the human cost of ideological certainty. The book kicks off by pointing straight to historical realities. We're talking internal purges, tribunals, executions. It frames these as tragic proof of what it calls the utopian paradox. The impartial argument here is that when an ideology truly believes it holds the absolute truth about some perfect future, it starts viewing actual human beings as basically just raw materials, like cogs in a machine. In these kinds of closed systems, taking a life is ultimately justified. Actually, it's rationalized as a quote-unquote necessary step to build heaven on earth.
Section 2, Popper versus the Prophecy, the Philosophical Scalpel.
So, to really dissect this, the author brings in the philosopher Karl Popper, specifically his massive critique of something called historicism. Now, historicism is basically the belief that history follows fixed, scientifically predictable laws towards some preordained end. The author uses Popper's framework to show how revolutionary movements convince their followers that their victory isn't just possible, it's scientifically guaranteed. The book argues that any theory claiming to predict the inevitable course of history, that's not science, that's prophecy. And once you convince people that victory is inevitable, violence becomes incredibly easy to rationalize. And this brilliantly illustrates the core conflict of the whole book. On one side, you have Popper's idea of the open society. This is a society that embraces the fact that humans make mistakes. It actually allows for criticism and relies on peaceful reform. On the flip side, you've got the closed society. This is where dogma rules, criticism is literally treated as treason, and violent revolution is the main tool in the toolbox. The book argues that the minute a movement refuses to let its ideas be challenged, it inevitably becomes a closed society. And a closed society has to use force to keep its narrative intact.
Section 3, Unmasking Chop Suey Sissonism and Assembled Doctrine.
Now, the book does this really rigorous dive into the intellectual roots of the local Maoist movement, and it makes a pretty bold claim about its foundational text, Philippine Society and Revolution. That text was originally published under the pseudonym Amado Guerrero, which the book says was done to cloak authorship and project this aura of authority. But the author actually asserts that the text was essentially copy-pasted, structurally lifted from an earlier Indonesian text by Dien Aidid. By calling this systematic borrowing and outright plagiarism, the book aggressively dismantles the whole myth of the founder's genius. It argues that the doctrine is actually resting on imported, unverified constructs rather than any real on-the-ground local evidence. So what actually happens when this imported doctrine completely fails to predict reality? Well, applying Popper's standard of falsifiability, the author points out that when the inevitable revolution promised by the movement failed to show up, they didn't rethink their theory. Nope, they just moved the goalposts. If the masses didn't rise up, the ideology blamed it on false consciousness. If their own members started questioning the timelines, they were slapped with labels like petty bourgeois deviation. Basically, the argument is that the ideology only survived by silencing any and all dissent.
Section 4, Defrosting of Frozen Reality, the Sociological Shift.
Moving forward, the book directly challenges the long-standing narrative that the country is permanently trapped in a semi-colonial and semi-feudal state. The author calls this a frozen reality, a static lens that completely ignores how complex the modern world actually is. Instead, the text introduces what it calls the better halves: sovereign interdependency and economic plurality. It argues that, hey, nations today operate in these huge dynamic networks of trade and mutual reliance, and they do it without giving up their sovereignty. Plus, it totally rejects those rigid old class categories. It points out that modern development is a really complex mix of digital economies, private sectors, cooperatives, and global remittances.
Now, what's really fascinating about this is how the author maps out the total collapse of that old utopian narrative. The argument here is that the rise of economic plurality, massive expansions in national infrastructure, and these huge waves of mass amnesty have fundamentally falsified the Marxist prediction that class polarization was going to be inevitable. It's like the structural conditions that were absolutely required for this prophesied revolution, they just don't exist anymore. They've been completely outpaced by actual geographic and economic reality.
Section 5. The Antidote: Popperian Activism in Practice. To explain the alternative to all this, the author uses this incredibly vivid, distinctly local metaphor. He says activism is society's check engine light. Think of democracy as a jeepney. When something's acting up, like, say, corruption or injustice, peaceful dissent is exactly what you need. It's a crucial warning system. An open society actually relies on that light to know when to fix the engine. Closed ideologies, on the other hand, look at those same grievances and use them as an excuse to just blow up the whole vehicle.
And that brings us to the concept of piecemeal social engineering. Basically, the author argues that society doesn't get better through violent overhauls. It gets better through small, reversible, evidence-based steps. You spot a problem, you test out a reform, you listen to criticism, and then you revise it. It's a constant, continuous system of error correction. This Popperian approach places a much higher value on the safety and stability of everyday citizens than on the sweeping, violent transformations demanded by utopian engineering.
Section 6. The Final Moral Verdict: Humans over Ideology.
So, the absolutely crucial point to take away from all this is right here. The author's ultimate philosophical stance is an unyielding defense of the individual human being. Because history doesn't actually follow some pre-written script, and because human knowledge is always fallible, absolutely no political objective can ever outweigh the sanctity of human life. The book makes it clear: an ideology that demands blood just to protect its own theories isn't a truth, it's a tragedy. We're going to end today's explainer with a really powerful, lingering paradox straight from the book. If history has no script, what is worth sacrificing a life for? It's a heavy question, right? It really asks us to step back and deeply reflect on the true value of human life when stacked up against the grand, sweeping promises of political ideologies. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the death of Utopia. Keep questioning everything, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.